Giants, wyverns and worms.
Spectral hounds, hairy hands and witches.
These isles are filled to the bursting with odd, uncanny places with a tale to tell.
In fact, we reckon that you're never more than a few miles away from a good bit of weird folk.
In this pod, we're on a mission to find the weirdest folk tales in Britain, the most bizarre, shocking and chilling stories etched out in the odd corners of the country where legends thrive.
But it's not just a mission, it's a competition. Who can tell the weirdest tale? I'm Sam.
And I'm Nikki.
And this is Weird Folk. Welcome to episode 2 of Weird Folk. This week I'm the host and I'm bringing you one of my favourite haunt stories, Leap Castle. Reportedly the most haunted place in Ireland, and there's plenty of contenders, so actually that makes it quite creepy. The castle was built around the early 1500s by the O'Bannon clan. The building that is there now is thought to have been built over a much earlier castle and a site that may well have been used for druids, but that's all kind of rumour, we're not really sure what's going on there. However, the story goes that there were two O'Bannon brothers who were contesting chieftainship of their clan, and the only way they wanted to settle it was essentially by having a display of strength and bravery, as you do when you're in 1500s Ireland, apparently, to get their right to be a chieftain. So they jumped off a rocky outcrop where the castle was meant to be built, and fueled by blood and death, the survivor became the chieftain, apparently. Don't know how true that story is, but that's certainly one of the origin stories of the castle itself. And it was in fact a stronghold of the O'Carroll clan later, who are very well known for how bloody and brutal they are. See an oubliette with 150 bodies that was discovered in part of the building, which is crazy. Apparently they murdered a lot of their enemies and then stored them away. The castle didn't stay in Irish hands. In fact, it's part of the Cromwellian invasion was the changing of hands to the Derby family, and a guy called John Derby took hold of the castle. And it's the Derbys themselves, in particular Mildred, that we're talking about today.
Yeah, Mildred Derby is a fantastically interesting character, actually. I mean, I will admit that when you first proposed this story, I wasn't massively keen on it. Because, as you know, I'm not that much into scary things. And when you said, this particular, I won't give away which bit of the story we're going to be talking about now, I was like, oh, God, I don't know if I can. But reading about Mildred Derby has been really fascinating. And I think I was, as my story might suggest, a bit sceptical to begin with. And I think...
I mean, it's the part of time when, occultism was very fashionable, and she clearly was into that fashion.
Fashionable, I think, is the word here. But I think with her, when you read her background, she was obviously somebody who was kind of into the Gothic, into writing, frustrated writer, wanted to write as a girl, but wasn't allowed to go to school because of, her parents' religious background, or she was allowed to go to school, but she wasn't allowed to continue higher education, which at that point was becoming quite popular for, middle class, upper class women. So I think, and then she kind of writes, doesn't she, when she gets to Ireland, when she gets to Leap?
Yeah, there's no evidence that she wrote before she got to the castle, but there's plenty afterwards because she published under a male pseudonym.
Yes, she did, and that is fascinating. If you want to, what was that male pseudonym? I have to maybe look it up. I might put it in the show notes for later because I cannot remember and I haven't written it down. But I think it's Andrew something.
Andrew Merry.
Andrew Merry. Yeah, because I looked up, and so her original writing is quite hard to come by. There were some reprints, I think, a couple of decades ago because there was some interest in her stories, because she's the way that we get these stories about Leap, isn't she?
She also was very clearly somebody who felt very strongly for the poor. So she ran away from home to join the Salvation Army, to hand out alms in London. She worked in the London slums before she married Jonathan Derby. But also she wrote quite a scandalous book at the time called The Hunger, which was about the mistreatment of the Irish peasants. That's a major theme within it.
I did read about that. I remember that being, it was about the potato famine, wasn't it?
Yeah, and it's part of what caused her husband to ban her from writing any further.
Yes, so he is... I wouldn't say interesting, because that would suggest that I'm interested in him in a way that wasn't complete disdain. But yeah, he comes across as not a great person. In fact,
Wasn't a pleasant man. Wasn't pleasant.
so unpleasant that the IRA burned down the castle in 1922. So, and his attitude towards his tenants was very much a driving force. I mean, there were other things going on, obviously, but his attitude towards his tenants was particularly brutal. And
Yeah, and
yeah,
clearly a point of contention between him and his wife.
yes, yeah. So, I think that this background in particular has fed into both of our stories, and so that we try to do verses every week, and I think the verses this week is: are you team skeptic or team believer? Are you a believer? So, because it is Samantha's pick today, you're going to go 1st with your
Yeah,
story.
so I'm going to lead in, and let's get underway.
Okay, all right. So, what's your story called?
So my story is called Hunger. It wears this place like a stony prison, a constricting skin that binds tight no matter how hard it rages and wriggles until all it knows is wrath. Wrath for the insolent creature that tore it from the dreaming place, where earthly energies dance without beginning or end, in the making and unmaking of all thought and memory and matter. It hadn't known pain or the inexorable decay of time before those strange sounds wrapped around its essence and cleaved it from eternity, until he crammed it into this pile of rocks with its crawling inhabitants and commanded it to burn. But it does not, will not, cannot. It is not a thing of fire unless that fire is hate. And so it lingers in its confinement. It learns to watch and understand the comings and goings of the fleshy beasts called men that roam within the walls that hold it captive. And it grows hungry. Mildred had not married for love, nor even particularly for like. She hadn't known her new husband long enough for either feeling to grow before their rushed nuptials. But Jonathan Darby, with his tales of an ancient family estate in Ireland and brooding good looks, seemed so like the dark heroes of her favourite Gothic novels that Mildred had been quite consumed by the romance of it all. By the time she discovered Jonathan's wicked temper and the awful state of her new home, it was far too late for regrets. Her first sight of Leap Castle came through a curtain of rain, as grey and miserable as the crumbling keep. Its squat square tower loomed as she climbed down from the carriage, like a mistrustful sentry in the fading afternoon. "It is very old?" she managed to say, then, with hope of creating a little levity after the strain of the journey, "I imagine it must be just rife with ghosts and wonderful stories. What's your favourite?" "There are no ghosts at Leap, no ghouls or any other ungodly nonsense," Jonathan snapped impatiently, already directing the servants to take her belongings to the family wing. "I do not encourage superstitious gossip, and I expect you to do the same." Oh. Mildred did not like the sound of that at all. No stories, no gossip. What else was she to do in this dreary place? It could not be tolerated. "Well, that is easily remedied. I shall simply keep the gossip to myself, as I can think of little better than tea and tales by the fire." Jonathan turned on her, his eyes furious, his face growing red. "I have forbidden it, and shall have no qualms dismissing any of our staff you scandalise." He was not a particularly large man, but he towered over Mildred, and her heart beat against her ribs with alarm. She bit back a retort and forced herself to nod. "As you say." Her rooms were no more welcoming than the rest of the castle, damp and dull. The connecting door to the dressing room she was to share with Jonathan stood open, and Mildred closed it without a second thought as she took in her new home. Austere, joyless, overpowered by ancient furniture that closed in upon the scattering of her things where they spilled from waiting trunks in riots of blue and red and yellow, like flowers seeking sunlight in a lonely cave. A strange smell lingered, vaguely rotten, creeping with mildew and the tang of copper. It reminded her of her days in the slums and the stench of the alleys as she did her best to deliver food parcels to the needy. Her hair prickled at the back of her neck the way it did then too, sensitive to the feeling of eyes upon her person, watching, waiting in the darkness. Mildred shivered. She longed for the adventures she found in novels, but forgot the most important lesson. Be careful what you wish for. In the weeks and months that followed, Mildred almost became accustomed to the strangeness of Leap Castle. The footsteps that haunted her down lonely corridors, the shadowy figures that lingered in empty rooms, and the frightful sense that she was never truly alone. Jonathan, of course, refused to listen to any word of it, though one night as he visited her chambers she saw him grow tense at the sound of a child's giggling in the distance. "The wind," he said, and Mildred was already too tired of their arguments to disagree, though she had taken to noting each experience in her journal. She even held her tongue when the renovations of the chapel began and cart upon cart of bones were dragged from a tiny cell concealed in the northeast corner. An oubliette, the steward called it. A place of forgetting where the occupants of Leap sealed away their enemies and let them rot. How long, Mildred wondered, had those poor souls been forgotten? As the sun set that evening, a strange miasma hung over the castle. 2 maids begged off sick, both pale with terror as they whispered weak excuses to flee to the safety of their village homes. Even Jonathan, for all his wilful ignorance, ordered every oil lamp lit, as if the blaze could fight the rising dark. But glowing hallways did nothing to lift the dread that traced lingering fingers down Mildred's spine. It was watching. It had watched before, squatting in corners, crawling through walls and over beams, but always distant, always waiting. Perhaps it's one of them," Kitty, her lady's maid, whispered as she unpinned Mildred's hair, restless now their bones have been disturbed. The idea hovered at the edge of Mildred's thoughts when she sat down to write at her bureau, the candles flickering over the curled pages of her journal. The notes she collected were beginning to take shape into a grim, wild tale of horror, one she intended to publish, though it would have to be under a pseudonym. But in the oppressive atmosphere, her robe tucked tight against the chill, words of terror flowed like water. So consumed was Mildred that she hardly noticed the way the fire began to die in the hearth or the oil lamps at her back. Not until the smell, that same awful reek of decay and rot and hot copper, rose in the bitter air until it was so cloyingly thick she could choke on it. She paused. Every sense screamed a warning. By all rights, she should be alone. Her chamber doors were firmly closed, the dressing room shut away, her husband's snoring almost silenced by the distance. And yet she knew without any doubt, that it was with her. Its breath brushed across her neck, fetid, cold, hungry. She could feel its presence, feel the scant inches where it crouched behind her back. She shouldn't look. To acknowledge a thing was to give it power, but she could not be still either, could not sit and wait for the touch of death to find her. "You are trapped," Mildred breathed. The air shifted behind her, the candles flickered. It was close, the weight of its being almost physical. This place is a prison. The pages of her journal tore under her fingers, the fine edges cutting so deep that blood stained the paper. Its stench deepened, nauseatingly thick. Mildred could taste the rot on her tongue as she clenched her teeth against a scream. "It traps me too," she cried out, her voice broken in the darkness. Stillness, absolute and thick with her terror. Mildred took a breath and swallowed back bile. As her heart battered against her ribs, she turned. It was not human, and never had been. No lonely lost soul wandering the keep in search of a resting place crouched before her. No, this was horror given form, a face rotted almost to bone with a long muzzle of a sheep grinning below. Hunched, misshapen, as if it had been stitched together in the idea of a man. A limb stretched towards her, crowned with a deformed hoof split into 3 fingers, and as it drew closer, as that twisted lump of sooty flesh reached towards her, the scream Mildred had tried so desperately to hold back hissed from between her teeth in a fearful whine. "Mildred!" Jonathan's voice cracked like a whip from the dressing-room doorway. "What poor maid have you dragged into your schemes now? Dressing her as a beast, have you no shame? But even as she began to protest, the thing was gone. "Which maid?" she asked instead, staring down her husband. There was fear behind his bluster. He could deny the truth of his own eyes as much as he liked, but in the dark, in that room, they shared their terror with one another. "Never mind," he sniffed. "It's late, you should rest." His eyes dropped to the curve of her belly, especially in your condition. The hunger stirs. It has sensed her from the moment her feet crossed the grimy threshold. Life, power, one of her kind can find it in these grounds. What if another can set it free? Hunger stirs again. But something else too, something fiercer than rage and more consuming than wrath. Hope.
Wow. So you've really gone quite deep there. I love those descriptions. Also, again, as of last week, I feel quite intimidated, but I am riding high on my win from our
Just
poll.
rub it in.
So I feel like actually I have maybe nothing to worry about. But I love what you did there because you've actually managed to set the stage for the castle, their relationship, and the that sense of the elemental. Because in Mildred's writing, so the book is called Kilman Castle, the House of Horror, and that is where she gives the description
Yeah.
of what you've called the hunger, but is referred to as the elemental, which is the part of the Leap Castle story that we're going to focus on. And I love how you've worked in there a couple of the kind of possible explanations as to where the elemental came from.
Yeah, I was very keen. So one of the things that I had seen in the, and I don't know who posited this theory, but one of them was that one of the O'Carrolls, I think it was, may well have, when they were attempting to take the castle from the O'Bannons, which they eventually successfully did, was suspected of having been a witch himself and summoned some form of elemental creature with the intention that it would burn out the house.
Yes.
Which it didn't do.
So I think that's Gerald Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare.
Oh, there you go. Not one of the O'Carrolls.
No. So I think Gerald Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare, he was a renowned magic practitioner and attempted to take over the castle on several occasions. So because Leap is strategically quite well placed, so lots of people had a go at kind of taking it over. But I think the other thing was that druidic magic, because it's such an ideal location where it is. The kind of druids used it apparently for rituals as well, or like it had been a place of worship. So there's lots of explanations. And then there is the really grisly oubliette explanation.
Yeah, the one where, so the whole theory was that perhaps it's not really an elemental, perhaps it's something that was sort of woken up or was a combined creature made from the kind of the horrific emotional backlash of having a pretty small, by the way, pretty small little room where you shoved people to die.
Yeah, and apparently the last person to put it there, so it was excavated. I couldn't find an exact date. Some people said 1922, but that's the date.
That's after it had burned.
Yeah, that's after it had burned. So the oubliette is definitely excavated when the Darbys are there.
It was part of the renovation, so that's where the record of the 150 bodies comes from.
3 cartloads.
Yeah.
But they did find an 1800s pocket watch on one of them.
Yeah, something. I think it was around the 1820s or 30s.
So
the pocket watch was dated
for them.
Yeah, it would have been within 50 years or so of when the excavation was done.
So you got to wonder what happened there, and also thinking about it. That would probably be within the lifetime of Jonathan Darby's parents, or maybe even his lifetime. Who did they shove down the oubliette?
He was only 35 when they married in the 1890s.
Maybe
so
his grandfather.
it would have been. Yeah, it would have been someone earlier. But they were in control of the castle for 300 years. So if they
definitely
were
one of them. Yeah. So it's one of those fascinating things, and it's their relationship. So you've kind of grabbed on to that as well. Their relationship is interesting, and you kind of also talked about the fact that Jonathan Darby kind of sees the elemental a couple of times, and in her diaries or her letters to friends, actually, she talks about how he came into her room in the middle of the night accusing her of dressing up the maid something as the elemental, and he'd seen it in the castle without her being there, and is flying into a rage accusing her of things, which is interesting.
It's one of the things that her friends report as well, right, is that he doesn't believe at all in any of this stuff, to the point of like almost willful blindness of some of the things going on, because there's been a lot of people since the Darbys who also report seeing things there. So Mildred herself described quite a lot of different things, not just the elemental.
Yeah, so there's quite a few. So in my story, I've kind of mentioned a few of them, but because we decided on the elemental as our focus, just keep it kind of focused, because you know that otherwise I would have written about the druids.
Yeah.
So because I don't.
And we can't just write druids.
No, we can't write druids every week, which is a shame, really.
Oh no!
Oh no, not druids every week. So this is our. You might notice this if you kind of listen to the rest of our episodes as they come in, that we definitely have like a different split between what we pick. So you are more of a folk horrorist, and
I love horror. I love weird creatures. I love weird people. I love the way that what we're frightened of tells us an enormous amount about what's actually happening in the lives of people experiencing it.
yes, I mean yes, but also there are nice mythological stories that do the same thing too. Anyway, we're not having this argument now.
They're all horror based, I would argue.
Next week's not. Right, so this is my story, and it is called The Unwilling Guest. I do have to point out before I start this that originally the couple, the Irvings, were supposed to be American. I won't be doing an American accent. If I accidentally slip into an American accent, I really apologise to any offence caused to people from the US. My American accent is very good. The Unwilling Guest. Are there really ghosts here, Mrs. Darby? Frederick Irving hears his wife's voice cut through the hubbub of dinner party chatter. Further down the elegant table, she's deep in conversation with a small, dark woman in a black beaded evening gown. Their host for this evening, the lady of the manor, the woman who convinced Leonore to take this jaunt halfway across Ireland to commune with her dead mother, gives Leonore a knowing smile. Oh, yes, Mildred Darby's eyes twinkle in the candlelight. It's what makes Leap so ideal as a location for contacting the other side. The spirits here are already amongst us. Why, just the other day, I was walking past the Blue Room when I was suddenly overcome by the most awful creeping feeling. And when I looked through the door, there she was. Who? Leonore asks, her voice breathless with excitement. The Red Lady of Leap Castle. Legend has it that her child was murdered by the bloodthirsty O'Carrolls, and she killed herself in grief. She likes to haunt that room in particular, for it was used for a nursery once. Frederick sees Leonore, and the well-dressed ladies around her shudder with fearful pleasure. He rolls his eyes in exasperation and stabs the last potato on his plate. Why had he come to Leap at all? It was one thing to accept an invitation to a séance in the bustle of the ballroom at the Shelbourne in Dublin, but surely it was madness to journey halfway across Ireland to the middle of nowhere to commune with the spirits. What had possessed him? What about the elemental, Mildred? An older woman in a stiff lace dress leans around him to address their hostess in hushed tones. Oh, that! Mildred Darby gives her audience an enticing smile. It's been very well behaved recently. We'd be very unlucky to see it tonight. Of course, it's very hard to predict when it will appear and who will be the unfortunate recipient of its attentions. The ladies around her give another little shudder of delighted terror. Frederick Irving struggles not to call out across the table to denounce Mildred Darby as a fraud. Did the woman think they were idiots? He stabs again at his potato. Well, he's not going to take part. They can all finish their dinner and continue this foolishness without him. But all too soon, the sweet trays are being cleared aside, and Mildred Darby is rising from the table. It is time. Come with me to the great hall, and we'll see if the spirits are receptive tonight. A tiny nervous titter sweeps across the table. All around him, the other guests, Leonore included, begin to gather themselves and move towards the door. But he stays, leaning back in the comfortable embrace of the dining chair. Perhaps he'll just remain here and finish the entire bottle of brandy on his own. No such luck. Before she reaches the door, Leonore spies him still seated and lets out a cry of disappointment. Oh, Frederick, aren't you coming with us? There's an appeal in her blue eyes that he ignores. Instead, he looks at the near-full brandy glass in front of him and says, Of course not, but you go have fun. Mildred Darby's rich voice responds. If we are to be visited by the dead tonight, they will surely wake their brethren who live in the castle. It would be most unwise to part from the group. Leonor casts him a pleading glance full of anxiety. He's sure he doesn't believe a single word Mildred Darby says, but Leonor obviously does. He gives a heavy sigh. Okay, fine. Let's get this charade over with. He's being rude, and he knows it. Yet Mildred Darby is unmoved. Be careful, Mr. Irving. The spirits of Leap are quite sensitive to scepticism. My husband shares your incredulity, yet the elemental, the most terrifying of the spirits at Leap, has appeared to him more times than anyone else. For a moment he feels the weight of her judgment in her clear gaze, and then she turns to lead them away to follow the other guests. They move through the long candlelit corridors to enter the central hall of the old medieval tower. Here the high walls are cut in two by a long minstrel gallery, which circles the walls to form an open passage to various wings of the castle. Above this gallery, the shadows of the walls make spectres of high, hanging portraits in the dim candlelight. In the centre of the room, the chairs and sofas have been moved back by unseen hands to make way for a round table of dark mahogany with 12 high-backed chairs. Mildred Darby ushers them along to the last empty seats. They sit apart, almost on opposite sides of the table, with Leonor tucked in right beside their host, as the guest of honour. His wife gives him a bashful smile, full of anticipation. We'll start by joining hands, their hostess orders once she is seated. The chatter around him dies as everyone turns their attention to her. The important thing is that everyone is receptive to the experience. Mildred Darby flicks a little glance of disapproval in his direction, and then bows her head and places her hands in her lap. Probably readying whatever contraption she has for faking this whole business, he thinks bitterly. But when he looks around at the other guests, he finds that everyone else is staring at Mildred Darby with hopeful, even hungry expressions on their faces. I call to you, spirits, Mildred Darby commands, her head still bowed. Come to me. Pass through that dark veil and reveal yourselves to us. There is a deep silence, and then she begins to sway, as though listening to her own silent song. Peeved and restless at this display, he looks over the tops of the heads of his companions at the panelled walls, where Darby ancestors of centuries past leer at him from their dark frames. Some are so old that the varnish on both the frame and the painting has darkened to the point where only vague features of the sitter are visible, just the hint of an eye or half a lip. He scans the room, his gaze ascending higher and higher until it finds the darkest corner of the minstrel gallery, where a pair of hollow eyes stare out from the shadows. A little thrill creeps along his arms, causing the hair to prickle against his skin. There must be a portrait in the depths of the gloom up there, but from here he can only make out the slight suggestion of a figure, an ashen round of a face, dark orbs for the eyes, and long thin arms that grip the rail of the balustrade. That can't be right. He blinks and shakes his head, hoping the figure would disappear. No, it's still there, if anything more than defines them before. The void of the eye sockets deeper, the horrible face coming into focus. His breath comes in short gasps. What is happening? He reaches out for the edge of the table to steady himself. It's a portrait. Nothing more. Nothing more. But then, what's that putrid smell? Earthy, old blood, sharp sulphur, and mouldering rags. The stink of a charnel house. The stench of the grave. Do you smell that? He whispers desperately to the well-dressed man next to him, who turns to frown at the interruption. Surely you smell that? He demands again, his eyes flicking back to the horrible figure that leers at him from the minstrel gallery. His voice has carried across the table and interrupted Mildred Darby as she calls for her spirit guide. Do you hear something, Mr. Irving? She inquires in a soothing tone, glancing at his hand clamped so hard on the table's edge that his knuckles are blanched with the force of his grip. No, he pants, trying to tear his horrified gaze from where the thing with the ghastly hollow face is leering at him. Surely somebody must smell that stench. There are murmurs from around the table. The well-dressed ladies and gentlemen turn to each other and then to him, and then begin to follow the line of his gaze up to the gallery. Surely they'll see it. Surely. But one by one, they frown and turn back to him. Leonore begins to get up to help him, but Mildred Darby waves her back into her seat. Do you see something, Mr. Irving? Mildred Darby inquires again, leaning up and out of her chair towards him, trying to attract his attention. They don't see it. Why don't they see it? Nothing. I see nothing. Nothing, I tell you. I just need to get some air. He finally frees himself from the thing and runs to the door, not even waiting to hear the responses from the others. Leonore can follow him later. It's that room. Yes, just the room. So stuffy. What he'd seen was probably a set-up by that charlatan Mildred Darby. She'd set something up on the balcony to frighten them all. The thought slows him down as he races through the corridors. He comes to a stop. Why had he been the only one to see it? They'd all looked. Why hadn't they seen it? Surely they would have told him if they had. Well, he wouldn't go back to them now. They could finish their silly show without him. It's over. He can sit and enjoy his own brandy in peace. He reaches for the handle of the dining room door, and as he does so, he feels someone put their hand upon his shoulders. His body sags with relief. It's Leonore. She's followed him. They'll leave this dreadful place immediately. He turns, his face already set in lines of both anger and relief, preparing to give his wife a piece of his mind about that little show in there. Well, Leonore, this is the stupidest... He stops, the words caught in his mouth. His face pales to chalk. His eyes are saucers of silver shock. It is not Leonore. Right next to him, so close that the stench clogs up his throat, is that ghostly, dead-eyed, disgusting thing. Frederick Irving, the skeptic who thought he knew it all, soils himself in terror, and then finds his breath, and screams until everything fades away to darkness.
Very nice descent into horror there, I thought.
Thank you.
Especially challenging our unbeliever. Mm-hmm. One of the things I really enjoyed you brought in there was the elements from the story that she wrote, right? The description of the guy who gets tapped on the shoulder and then turns around to find it. I thought it was really nicely kind of brought into there to lean into the description that she tells.
I think that's one of the things that most frightens me about the elemental is that the descriptions of the interactions with it touches people.
Yeah.
Like, it's so gross to even see a ghost, to be touched by a ghost. I think I based Frederick Irving's response on what I think I would do.
Yeah.
Just silence myself and then pass out.
Just collapse, yeah.
yeah, basically. But what I didn't want to write about him and her, because I thought that's what you might write about. So Frederick Irving is obviously just a version of Mildred Darby's husband.
Yeah.
But I think there is that also, like, slightly misogynistic skepticism going on here. My silly wife likes seances, so they must be ridiculous.
Yeah, it's interesting because women were, although there were plenty of men, famously Arthur Conan Doyle, plenty of men involved in this kind of occultist movement and particularly in spiritualism. It was a massive place for women to meet and have these kind of conversations and discussions. A lot of the salons were very heavily female, and it was quite a heavy kind of female power area because many of the spiritualists were women.
But you could see that as like a pushback against it in general. And it's kind of interesting that Mildred Darby's husband comes across as like, I don't know, like a traditional husband 101. And she is very much not. And actually, by the end of her life, they're separated. She's living back in Brighton again. I think she dies in England.
Yeah, she does. She does. And he stays in Ireland. I mean, he's not reported by anybody who knew him to be a particularly pleasant man, and certainly terrorised her and their children.
Yes.
And I think it got to the point where they couldn't stand to live together, and also the children were old enough that she could separate from him.
I love that he's the thing that drives out Loop Castle.
Yeah, not the monster.
Not the Loop Castle elemental.
Well, no, what drives them out of the castle is the fact that they are told that the tenants are going to burn the castle down, and they flee.
Why do I forget about the castle burning down?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's interesting because somebody is trying to restore bits of it at the moment, and actually the Leap Castle website is excellent as a resource. Like they've put such a lot of effort into letting you know about it. Because obviously neither of us have ever been to Leap Castle. I would love to go to Leap Castle. In fact, I've had so many times had a driving holiday across Ireland, like sorted out, and then just never booked anything. So
Yeah.
I'd love to do that. I mean, I think one of the things that's fascinating about this story, in the same way that the story last week, which was the Rollright Stones, is fascinating, is people's explanations of the world around them. Like the oubliettes and the connection with druids and kind of things that's gone on, the way that history becomes part of, because all the other ghosts have believed that there are plenty of other ghosts. The elemental is not the only one.
It's not even the nastiest one.
No. I mean, yeah, there's there's the really horrible, the two girls.
The children that run around,
yeah. Well, one of them runs around without half their legs.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, and the governess, I mentioned there is the Red Lady.
And the people who live there now talk about, there's a figure of a man that climbs out of the oubliette and then wanders around part of the castle, which I hate
that.
Yeah, I would also hate that.
Yes. No, this is not a space for me. I was discussing this with somebody the other day, and I think when I was 18, if somebody had invited me for a seance because the craft was out, the craft is I feel like this is our mention for this.
We had our teen witch patch, if you remember.
Yeah, the teen witch patch, and I remember being obsessed with it. If somebody had invited me to a seance, I'd be like, great. I mean, I definitely used a Ouija board during that time.
We both did with our cousin, yeah.
Yeah, and I think
then our nan hid it.
Yeah. And then I am too chicken these days because I don't know if I could cope with just the results of that. So
I was going to ask if you'd seen a horror movie that I can guarantee you haven't seen, so there's no point asking the question.
Let's not do so I'm a bit more of a turn of the screw kind of ghost story person. I can handle The Woman in Black, the book, not the film, because the book is great. Maybe The Woman in Black should be our recommendation for this week. But I think Leap Castle is fascinating in so many ways. It's really well worth going up and reading the rest of the ghost stories that we didn't have time for today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And reading more about Mildred as well. She really was quite a remarkable woman. She was an incredible shot. She ran a women's cricket team.
Yes,
she seems to be quite a lively person who breathed life into the castle itself.
Yes.
And put an enormous amount of effort into entertaining there and introducing. I quite like that we've chosen sort of different aspects of that personality within the stories.
Yes. Yeah, because mine is very much an older Mildred, and I wanted that idea of somebody turning up to a seance and being an unbeliever, like being forced to be there and having this. And I also liked the idea of the elemental being a bit cheeky and being like, you don't believe in me, so you are gonna get the jump scare.
Like cats.
Yes, very much like the elemental is like a cat. I feel like that's a perfect place to end this episode. Are elementals, which are supposed to be druidic spirits, like cats? I mean, that's a question for everybody to answer themselves. The actual question for that's going to go up on Instagram is: are you a believer like Mildred Darby from Samantha's story? So you're representing the believers.
I am, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm kind of representing the Jonathan Darby side, which is: are you a skeptic? Will you get the jump scare from the elemental cat? Or really, which story did you most enjoy this week? As always, check us out on Instagram. Go to the Leap Castle website and have a look at that. It's super cool. And we shall see you next week for one of my choices, which I guarantee will not be as scary, which is based on the Jack the Giant Slayer myth, kind of folklore from Cornwall. We shall see you next week. Keep writing weird. You have been listening to Weird Folk. Weird Folk is written and edited by Nikki Watson and Sam Moody. Our theme song is Dominion of the Sword, as performed by the brilliant Melrose Quartet, arrangement by the legendary Martin Carthy. Our cover art is by the wonderful Kate Unwin at the Moon on Furrow. Keep writing weird.